Did you ever have to pretend everything was fine when it really wasn't?
I can still picture that evening at the Olive Garden with such vivid clarity that it feels like the fluorescent lights overhead are buzzing right in my ears even now. The kind of family gathering that begins with the superficial chatter about daily routines and the latest neighborhood gossip, but quickly unravels into the deeper resentments that have simmered for years beneath the surface of our so-called bonds. Where my sister Lisa, ever the one to command the spotlight with her meticulously styled hair and that piercing laugh which always seems to carry an undercurrent of superiority, had orchestrated what she billed as a joyous reunion for Mom, Dad, my brother Tom along with his perpetually cheerful wife Sarah, and even Aunt Clara, who has this habit of commenting on everyone's food choices as if she's the arbiter of taste. Though in truth I arrived feeling a mix of reluctant optimism and the familiar twinge of unease that accompanies these events, because as a 45-year-old nurse juggling shifts and single parenthood after my messy divorce, I know better than to expect genuine warmth from a group where I've always occupied the role of the outsider, the adopted daughter plucked from circumstances nobody likes to discuss. Dressed simply in my faded jeans and a comfortable blouse that contrasts sharply with Lisa's flashy ensemble complete with accessories that scream financial security I can only dream of. The meal progressed with the usual parade of appetizers, those endless breadsticks disappearing into hands that gestured animatedly while Tom regaled us with exaggerated tales of his children's soccer triumphs and Mom fussed over the portions, as though controlling the calories on our plates could somehow extend to managing the imbalances in our affections, and for a fleeting moment it almost felt like we were just a normal American family sharing stories over plates of steaming fettuccine Alfredo and hearty meatballs, the aromas mingling with the clink of silverware and the distant hum of other diners enjoying what seemed like uncomplicated evenings. But then, as the entrees arrived in all their saucy glory and the conversation lulled into that awkward pause where true feelings threatened to bubble up, Lisa leaned back in her chair with a deliberate arch to her eyebrows and declared in a voice loud enough to turn heads from the adjacent booth, "Rachel, why don't you go find another table, because this one's reserved for real family, not strays who wander in hoping for scraps," and the reaction was immediate and devastating, with the entire table bursting into laughter that started with Tom's booming chuckle and spread like wildfire to Sarah's polite giggles and even Mom's hesitant snicker that she tried to disguise behind a napkin, while Dad merely stared down at his half-eaten lasagna as if the cheese could offer some escape from the cruelty unfolding right there amid the checkered tablecloths and plastic vines dangling from the faux Italian decor. In that instant, the heat flooded my cheeks not in explosive anger, but in the slow, searing realization of how deeply ingrained this dismissal ran. A reminder that despite all the years I've poured into loving them unconditionally, I remain the perpetual interloper in their narrative, the child they took in out of obligation rather than choice, and the sting was compounded by Aunt Clara's feeble attempt to deflect with a comment about passing the garlic bread, though her eyes held a flicker of sympathy that only heightened my isolation in the midst of what should have been a safe space. The atmosphere thickened with that artificial joviality masking the underlying malice, every bite I forced down tasting like ash as the group pretended to move on to lighter topics like the upcoming holidays and Tom's promotion at the auto shop. But the words hung there like an unspoken verdict on my worth, making me question yet again why I subjected myself to these rituals when they invariably chipped away at the fragile self-respect I'd built through long nights at the hospital and mornings rushing my daughter to school with a smile that hid the exhaustion. Just a few minutes later, as the plates were cleared and the remnants of tiramisu sat untouched in their delicate cups, the waiter named Miguel, a young man with a warm accent and an efficient stride, approached with the leather folder containing the bill and placed it squarely in front of Lisa, the total scrawled in bold ink as $320 for the feast that had turned so sour, and she wrinkled her nose in that entitled way of hers, clearly assuming Dad or perhaps Tom would swoop in as always to cover the extravagance she had orchestrated without a second thought to budgets or fairness. Without uttering a single protest or drawing unnecessary attention, I extended my hand across the table, slipped my credit card into the folder with a steadiness that belied the turmoil inside me, and handed it back to Miguel, who nodded appreciatively before vanishing toward the register, leaving the table in a stunned hush broken only by Lisa's mumbled, "Well, thanks, I suppose." That carried no genuine gratitude, but rather the petulance of someone unaccustomed to reciprocity. Rising from my seat with as much dignity as I could muster, I shouldered my purse, whose strap suddenly felt like an anchor weighing down the evening's indignities, and murmured an excuse about an early morning shift pulling me away from this charade. My footsteps echoing softly on the tiled floor as I wove past the dessert carts laden with temptations nobody at our table deserved, and pushed through the heavy doors into the crisp night air that offered a brief illusion of freedom from the suffocating dynamics I'd just endured. Yet, mere steps from my reliable but unremarkable Honda parked under the lot's harsh lights, a voice emerged from the shadows near the entrance, soft and tentative yet insistent, calling out, "Wait, don't go just yet," and turning around I saw Dad standing there alone, his posture slightly hunched against the chill, as if the weight of unspoken regrets had finally caught up to him in that moment. His expression a complex blend of apology and something far more profound that hinted at revelations waiting to surface if I chose to step back into the fray rather than drive away into the anonymity of the rain-slicked streets. Dad's voice carried across the dimly lit parking lot with that familiar rasp honed from decades of chain-smoking and half-spoken truths. The kind of tone that always pulled me back into the fold even when every instinct screamed to keep walking toward my car and the solitary drive home through the suburban sprawl where streetlights flickered like unreliable confidants. So I halted beside the driver's door of my Honda, keys jingling softly in my hand as the cool autumn breeze rustled the fallen leaves around our feet and carried faint echoes of laughter from inside the restaurant where the rest of the family lingered over coffee refills, oblivious to the fracture widening out here under the sodium haze. He approached with his usual shuffle, hands thrust deep into the pockets of his worn windbreaker as if clutching onto fragments of resolve, and launched into an apology that tumbled out in fits and starts, insisting Lisa had spoken out of turn due to the pressures of her high-stakes job in finance, where deadlines loomed like storm clouds and colleagues schemed like characters from those corporate thrillers we used to watch on lazy Sundays. But even as he painted her as the victim of circumstance, I could sense the undercurrent of deflection because his eyes kept sliding toward the restaurant's glowing windows where silhouettes moved in animated discussion, avoiding the direct confrontation that might force him to acknowledge how such barbs had become Lisa's weapon of choice in our sibling rivalry that dated back to the sandbox days when her natural-born status granted her an invisible crown I could never wear. We stood there amid the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional beep of locking cars, the air thick with the lingering scent of garlic and regret, and Dad shifted the conversation to praise my handling of the bill, calling it an act of true grace under fire in a world where folks these days air their grievances on social media rather than swallowing pride like the generations before us did, which elicited a wry chuckle from me because what he didn't grasp was how paying for their indulgence felt less like nobility and more like the quiet assertion of my independence from the cycle of expectations that had me footing emotional tabs for years, without reciprocity. Probing gently amid his ramblings, I asked about the home front, noting how Mom's recent phone calls had grown clipped and evasive as if she were rationing words to hide the creaks in their retirement nest egg. And Dad brushed it aside with a dismissive wave coupled with a joke about how marriage after 40 years was like an old car that needed constant tune-ups, but still got you where you needed to go. Yet he let slip a telling detail about Lisa stepping up with financial advice and occasional transfers to ease the monthly squeezes from medical bills and property taxes that had crept up since the market dipped last year. That admission hung between us like a loose thread, begging to be pulled, hinting at resentments deeper than mere jealousy, because if Lisa was playing benefactor it explained her entitlement at the table, but also raised questions about why such generosity came laced with exclusion. And as we exchanged that awkward half-hug reeking of his aftershave mixed with the evening's feast, he promised a proper sit-down soon to hash things out away from the group's peanut gallery, his words carrying a sincerity that almost convinced me to linger but ultimately propelled me into the car with a nod and a wave that masked the churning doubt in my stomach. The drive home wound through familiar neighborhoods where porch lights illuminated driveways cluttered with kids, bikes, and minivans, a stark contrast to the isolation gnawing at me as I replayed Dad's evasions and Lisa's smirk. Pulling into my own modest driveway just past 10 where the house sat dark except for the faint glow from my daughter's bedroom nightlight, a reminder of the one unconditional bond that anchored me through these familial tempests. Settling into the kitchen with a mug of herbal tea that did little to soothe the raw edges, I scrolled idly through family albums on my phone, pausing on snapshots from our childhood vacations where Lisa's smiles always seemed a shade too forced beside my oblivious grins. The kind of subtle discord that hindsight illuminated like clues in a forgotten mystery novel, and just as drowsiness began to claim me around midnight, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from an unrecognized local number. The voice on the other end hushed and urgent, whispering something about overhearing Lisa on a call inside the restaurant moments after I left, mentioning inheritance shares and keeping the stray out of it, in a context that twisted my gut with implications of exclusion far beyond that evening's slight, leaving me wide awake and staring at the ceiling as rain began to patter against the window like impatient fingers demanding answers I wasn't sure I wanted to chase. That anonymous call lingered in my mind like a half-remembered dream as I lay there in the dim glow of my bedside lamp with rain drumming steadily against the roof and the house creaking in response to the night's restless winds. The caller's hushed warning about Lisa's conversation on inheritance slicing through the quiet and forcing me to confront how such casual cruelty at dinner might stem from stakes far higher than sibling pettiness, perhaps involving the family assets Dad had always alluded to in vague terms during tax season discussions that left Mom changing the subject to safer topics like recipe swaps with neighbors. Morning arrived with a kind of gray drizzle that mirrors inner turmoil, pulling me from a fitful sleep where visions of old family photos alternated with the sting of Lisa's words. And after dropping my daughter off at school with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a quick peck on the cheek that briefly chased away my shadows, I headed to the hospital for my shift amid the fluorescent-lit corridors where the beeps of monitors and hurried footsteps provided a rhythmic distraction from personal entanglements. Though even as I tended to patients with their stories of loss and resilience, the anonymous tip gnawed at me, prompting a discreet text back to the number during my lunch break only to receive a reply directing me to meet at the corner coffee shop after work if I wanted the full context without risking family ears. The afternoon dragged with the usual parade of charts and consultations, but anticipation built like pressure in a storm cloud. And by the time I clocked out, the rain had eased into a misty haze that clung to the parking lot as I drove to the quaint downtown spot with its steamed windows and the aroma of fresh brews wafting out to greet me, where Aunt Clara waited in a corner booth nursing a latte and looking every bit the reluctant whistleblower with her sensible cardigan and the faint lines of worry etched around eyes that had witnessed decades of our clan's dysfunction. She didn't mince preliminaries once I slid into the seat opposite her, launching straight into the details of what she'd overheard Lisa muttering into her phone right after the bill fiasco, while the rest of us pretended normalcy over dessert remnants. Something about ensuring the will's provisions stayed airtight to protect blood assets from dilution by interlopers, a phrase that hit like a gut punch because it confirmed the undercurrent of exclusion wasn't spontaneous, but calculated, tied to the inheritance Dad's side of the family had built through a small manufacturing business that sputtered along until his retirement left it vulnerable to probate squabbles. Clara's narrative unfolded with the precision of someone who'd bottled up observations for years, recounting how Lisa's jealousy had roots in our childhood dynamics where I, as the adopted newcomer, unwittingly drew Mom's nurturing focus during those early years when Lisa struggled with the spotlight shift after being the only child for 5 formative ones, leading to petty sabotages like hiding my toys or whispering to friends that I was just pretend family. Behaviors that evolved into the sharper barbs of adulthood fueled by her career frustrations in a field where glass ceilings loomed large for women of our generation. We shared a moment of levity when Clara imitated Lisa's haughty phone posture with exaggerated flair, her voice dropping to a mock whisper that had me stifling a laugh because amid the hurt there was something absurdly human about how envy could twist even the strongest ties into knots, yet the humor faded as she delved deeper. admitting she'd stumbled upon an old letter in Mom's attic clutter during a recent cleanup visit, a document from the adoption agency dated around my arrival that alluded to financial incentives from distant relatives who viewed expanding the immediate family as a way to consolidate estate benefits. Without the messiness of trusts, her reluctance to elaborate stemmed from loyalty to Mom, who had always shielded the pragmatic side of my placement behind a veil of pure-hearted charity, but the revelation planted seeds of doubt about the purity of their intentions, making me grapple with the uncomfortable truth that my place in the family might have been as much transaction as affection, a dilemma that left me torn between demanding clarity and preserving the fragile peace that kept holidays bearable. As we parted with Clara pressing a napkin-scribbled note into my hand containing the letter's approximate location for my own sleuthing, the weight of potential discoveries settled over me like the evening fog rolling in. And driving home through streets lined with Halloween decorations that mocked the ghosts of unresolved pasts, I felt the conflict intensify, wondering if unearthing such secrets would heal the rift or shatter the illusions we all relied on to function. Later that night, after tucking my daughter in with a bedtime story about brave orphans finding their way, I pored over digitized family albums on my laptop, zooming in on faded images from my early school days where Lisa's gaze held a resentment I now recognized as precursor to the dinner slight. And just as resolve hardened to confront her subtly, the next day my email pinged with an unexpected attachment from an old family acquaintance, a scanned photo of a toddler with features eerily mirroring a blend of mine and Lisa's that suggested biological threads far more tangled than anyone had admitted, its implications hanging unresolved as sleep evaded me once more under the relentless patter of rain that seemed to whisper promises of storms yet to break. The scanned photo from that unexpected email haunted my thoughts throughout the following day as I navigated the hospital's bustling emergency wing with its symphony of paging tones and the metallic tang of antiseptics in the air. The image of that toddler's face, a delicate fusion of my own wide-set eyes and the subtle curve of Lisa's jawline, stirring a whirlwind of questions about biological secrets that could upend the foundational lies I'd accepted as my origin story, making every routine procedure feel like a metaphor for dissecting the family's carefully preserved facade where adoption papers had always been waved away as ancient history not worth revisiting amid the chaos of raising us. By evening, after a shift that left me drained yet wired with unresolved curiosity, I arranged to meet Aunt Clara again at her cozy bungalow on the outskirts of town. The one cluttered with doilies and faded quilts that spoke of a life steeped in the same generational traditions our family clung to like lifelines, where she greeted me at the door with a steaming pot of her chamomile blend and a knowing glance that suggested she'd anticipated my return for deeper dives into the shadows we'd only skimmed the surface of during our coffee shop confessional. Settling into the overstuffed armchair by the fireplace whose crackle provided a rhythmic backdrop to our unfolding revelations, Clara wasted no time in steering the conversation back to the letter she'd mentioned, pulling it from a locked drawer in her antique desk with hands that trembled slightly from the weight of custodianship. The yellowed pages detailing not just the procedural aspects of my adoption, but a clause about supplemental funds from a paternal great-uncle's estate that required the family to demonstrate unity through an expanded household, a pragmatic maneuver disguised as benevolence that positioned me as the key to unlocking resources meant to bolster the bloodline's legacy without the complications of contested wills. Her explanation wove through the intricacies with the candor of someone who'd pieced together the puzzle over years of overheard arguments and cryptic tax filings, revealing how Mom and Dad had navigated those early financial tightropes by leveraging my arrival to secure stability during a period when Dad's business teetered on bankruptcy's edge. Yet in doing so they inadvertently sowed the seeds of Lisa's resentment by shifting affections and resources toward the newcomer who symbolized both salvation and intrusion in her young world. We paused for a shared laugh at the absurdity of it all, Clara quipping that it was like turning family into a board game where pieces got traded for properties. Her light-hearted jab cutting through the heaviness, because even in betrayal there was that ridiculous human element of scrambling for security in an economy that chews up dreams like so much chaff. But the mirth ebbed as she confessed her own complicity in the silence, having learned of the financial angles during a heated sibling spat with Mom years ago and choosing loyalty over truth to avoid fracturing the already fragile unit. The dilemma gnawed at me fiercely in that moment, torn between forgiving the past as a product of desperate times or digging further into these monetary motives that reframed my entire upbringing as a calculated investment rather than pure-hearted choice. A conflict that mirrored the broader uncertainties in my life, where I'd always prioritized harmony over confrontation, much to the frustration of friends who urged me to demand my due in everything from alimony to apologies. Clara's alliance deepened when she handed over a sheaf of bank statements photocopied from Dad's files during her last visit to help with spring cleaning. The numbers highlighting irregular transfers initiated by Lisa under the guise of investment advice that funneled family savings into accounts bearing her name alone, patterns that screamed embezzlement. Dressed up as savvy management in an era where adult children often blurred lines between support and self-interest. Driving away from Clara's under a canopy of stars that pierced the clearing night sky, the documents tucked securely in my glove compartment, I wrestled with the urge to call Dad immediately or bide time to gather irrefutable proof. The windshield reflecting my furrowed brow as memories flooded in unbidden flashbacks to childhood summers where Lisa's sulks over shared vacations masked her growing awareness of the fiscal favoritism that positioned me as the unwitting beneficiary of those unlocked funds. The next afternoon, seizing a rare overlap in our schedules, I suggested coffee with Lisa at the neutral ground of a chain cafe buzzing with after-work crowds, where her initial defensiveness softened into feigned contrition over the dinner incident, claiming work stress had amplified her insecurities about family roles in a world where women like us juggled careers and caregiving without the safety nets our parents once had. Seizing the moment for a subtle revenge that felt more like poetic justice than outright attack, I steered the talk to old family lore about that great-uncle's generous strings, recounting a fabricated anecdote from Clara about how such provisions always caught the greedy off guard like a bad bet at the track. Watching Lisa's composure crack as her fingers tightened around her mug and excuses about coincidental timings spilled forth in a rush that betrayed her unease. She departed abruptly with a brittle hug and a promise to make amends, but in her haste, she left behind her planner on the booth seat, its pages flipping open to reveal calendar notes linking those suspicious transfers to meetings with shady financial advisors. Proof that tied her directly to the siphoning and escalated the impending confrontation into a powder keg waiting for the spark I now held in my hands as I slipped it into my bag, heart pounding with the realization that exposing this could redefine real family forever or leave me holding the pieces of a bond already in ruins. With Lisa's forgotten planner burning a metaphorical hole in my conscience as I steered my Honda through the familiar winding roads toward the family home on that crisp Saturday afternoon where autumn leaves swirled like confetti from a party nobody wanted to attend, I felt the culmination of all the unearthed secrets converging into a resolve that had simmered through sleepless nights and whispered doubts, the pages within detailing not just the timelines of those illicit transfers from Dad's accounts, but also annotations linking them to offshore setups that screamed desperation in a woman who'd always projected invincibility amid her career climbs and social media facades. Mom had summoned us all under the pretense of a casual barbecue to mend fences after the dinner debacle, her text messages laced with pleas for unity that rang hollow given the undercurrents I'd navigated alone. And arriving at the backyard where the grill smoked lazily under Dad's watchful eye and the picnic table groaned under platters of potato salad and ribs slathered in sauce that masked the bitterness of unresolved grudges, I was greeted by the assembled faces, Tom and Sarah chasing their kids around the playset, Aunt Clara stirring lemonade with a conspiratorial wink in my direction, and Lisa perched on a lawn chair like a queen surveying her realm, her smile tight as she complimented the weather in a voice that dripped false sweetness. The afternoon unfolded with the obligatory small talk about neighborhood changes and the latest election buzz that divided opinions like family lines. Laughter punctuating stories of past vacations where the warmth felt genuine in hindsight, but now carried the taint of selective memories, and I played along with measured contributions, slipping the planner into my tote bag concealed among napkins and my daughter's forgotten toy, biding time as the sun dipped lower and cast elongated shadows that mirrored the lengthening suspense in my chest. Tension thickened when Lisa sidled up during a lull in the grilling, her perfume cloying as she murmured an apology for the restaurant's light, attributing it to hormonal fluctuations from perimenopause that affected her filter in ways she regretted. A confession that might have elicited sympathy in another context, but only fueled my quiet amusement at how she reframed cruelty as biology, prompting me to respond with a lighthearted quip about how family tables always seem to bill the wrong person for the drama, my words laced with just enough edge to make her pause and glance away toward the kids' shrieks. As dusk settled and Mom called everyone to the table for the main feast, plates clattering with utensils and the aroma of charred meat mingling with the faint chill in the air, she raised a glass of iced tea and a toast to enduring bonds that weather storms like the one brewing unspoken among us, the clink of glass echoing like a fragile truce, and that's when Lisa, emboldened perhaps by the group's nodding agreement, chimed in with a toast of her own to real families sticking together without strays complicating the picture, her eyes locking onto mine with a challenge that dared me to react amid the murmurs of amusement from Tom and Sarah, who hadn't yet grasped the full venom. Seizing the moment with a steadiness born from days of rehearsal in my mind, I stood slowly, pulling the planner from my bag and flipping it open to the incriminating pages under the string lights that illuminated the yard like a makeshift stage, my voice calm yet carrying across the hush as I outlined the discrepancies in Dad's finances, the transfers disguised as loans that funneled thousands into her personal ventures, emails printed from the attached drive detailing consultations with advisors who skirted legal edges, and how it all tied back to her resentment over the inheritance clauses that had welcomed me into the fold decades ago, not as charity, but as a strategic move to secure the very assets she now coveted exclusively. The revelation landed like a thunderclap without the roar, Dad's face paling as he set down his fork with trembling hands and demanded explanations that Lisa supplied in stammers about temporary bridges for her mounting debts from a failed side hustle in real estate flips that promised quick returns in a volatile market. But I interjected with witty precision, noting how ironic it was that the woman who decried strays at the table had been pilfering from the family pot like a fox in the henhouse, my analogy drawing a choked laugh from Aunt Clara and stunned silence from the rest, the clever sting exposing not just the theft, but the hypocrisy that had poisoned our dynamics for years. Mom's eyes welled with a mix of betrayal and confusion, torn between defending her golden child and acknowledging the truths Clara and I had unearthed about the adoption's fiscal underpinnings, while Tom muttered about consulting a lawyer that escalated the evening into fractured whispers and averted gazes, Lisa slinking toward the house with excuses about a headache that rang as false as her earlier toasts. In the end, I handed the planner to Dad with a quiet assurance that the choice of next steps rested with him, whether to involve authorities or pursue internal reckoning. My revenge manifesting not in shouts or ultimatums, but in the unassailable light of evidence that forced everyone to confront the illusions we'd maintained, leaving the backyard gathering to dissolve into the night with hugs that felt obligatory and promises of calls that might never come. Driving away under a canopy of stars that offered no clear answers, the weight of potential fractures lingered in my thoughts, wondering if this exposure had liberated me from the stray label or merely scattered the pieces of what family meant. With questions about forgiveness and blood ties hanging unresolved like the smoke from the dying grill, prompting a deeper reflection on whether true belonging ever hinged on origins or the quiet choices we make in the face of rejection.